9. Landmarks and land. The law with respect to landmarks has already been considered with respect to its meaning in matters of social inheritance. This meaning has long been a familiar one, common among the church fathers and schoolmen. Luther remarked that landmarks are not to be moved from where they have been placed by the former dwellers, means that we are to add nothing to the doctrine transmitted by the apostles, as though one could give better advice in matters of conscience. The primary meaning of the law, however, has reference to land. Thou shalt not remove thy neighbour's landmark, which they of old time have set in thine inheritance, which thou shalt inherit in the land that the Lord thy God giveth thee to possess it. Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 14. The law is cited also in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 17, Job chapter 24, verse 2, and Proverbs chapter 22, verse 28, and chapter 23, verse 10. This law appears also in other ancient law codes. In Rome, removal of the landmark was punishable by death. According to Calvin, for that everyone's property may be secure, it is necessary that the landmarks set up for the division of fields should remain untouched, as if they were sacred. He who fraudulently removes a landmark is already convicted by this very act, because he disturbs the lawful owner in his quiet possession of the land, whilst he who advances further the boundaries of his own land to his neighbour's loss doubles the crime by the deceptive concealment of his theft. Whence also we gather that not only are those thieves who actually carry away their neighbour's property, who take his money out of his chest, or who pillage his cellars and granaries, but also those who unjustly possess themselves of his land. Calvin's point is a valid one. The deceit of the act makes it a double crime. It is both theft and false witness. Because the law is a unit, the violation of one law is a violation of the whole law, as St. James summarized it. For whoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all. James chapter 2, verse 10. Thus, this crime involves violation of the 8th and 9th Commandments, and also the 10th, coveting our neighbour's land. Crimes against the land can also involve the 4th Commandment, the Sabbath law, and the 6th, thou shalt not kill. Land laws are an important aspect of the biblical legislation. The Talmud comments on these laws at length. The land, the rabbis noted, remains holy unto the Lord, for the land is mine. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 23. Even in the hands of the heathen. Hence, the heathen are accountable to God for the care of the land and for the tithe. The reason for the sabbatical year, according to Rabbi Abahu, is that the Holy One, blessed be He, said to Israel, sow your seed 6 years, but omit the 7th, that ye may know that the earth is mine. Of particular interest is the comment of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said, any man who has no wife is no proper man, for it is said, male and female created he them, and called their name Adam. Rabbi Eliezer further stated, any man who owns no land is not a proper man, for it is said, the heavens are the heavens of the Lord, but the earth hath he given to the children of men. Since man's calling is to exercise dominion, the rabbis recognize that the two basic areas for the exercise of dominion are in the family and in relation to the earth. Man's duty here is binding on all men. The land laws required a Sabbath rest for the land. Exodus chapter 23, verses 10 and 11. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 1 to 11. The true meaning of the Sabbath is rest rather than worship, and a rest due to the land itself for the revitalizing of the earth. To deny a Sabbath to the land is to defraud that land and to rob it of its due. Bonner commented on this law that it has been well said that by the weekly Sabbath they owned that they themselves belonged to Jehovah, and by this seventh-year Sabbath they professed that the land was his, and they his tenants. At the heart of the land law is the declaration, "The land shall not be sold forever, for the land is mine, for ye are strangers and sojourners with me." Leviticus chapter 25, verse 23. This law sounds especially strange in modern ears, for farmland has become, especially in North America, an area for speculative buying and selling, and the changes of ownership in some areas are very many. In most of the world, land has been and still is regarded as an inalienable family possession. Perhaps the most important resistance to communism and the communist empire has come not from foreign countries, but from the long-suffering and stubbornly resisting peasants. The sale of lands and the confiscation of land, these are things the peasant refuses to accept. Land is an inheritance which cannot be alienated. The peasant parties of the various European countries have been responsible groups, and their leaders superior politicians and statesmen. Significantly, the International Peasant Union, with its stubborn resistance to the Soviet Empire, has as its emblem a green flag, the colour of budding crops and of hope. It is important, therefore, to analyse carefully the meaning of Leviticus chapter 25, verses 23 to 28, and then its significance for our times. First, the general rule is that the land shall not be sold forever, or literally, to annihilation. That is, so as to vanish away from or be forever lost to the seller. Sales were in effect leases, because no man had the right to alienate the Lord's land. Second, if a man became poor and sold his farm, his kinsmen could redeem the land and restore it at once to him. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 25, verses 48 and 49. Third, if the owner had no relatives able to redeem the land for him, and he earned enough to do it himself, he could calculate the years remaining until the Jubilee year and pay off the buyer for the years of his lease, which still remained. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 26 and 27. Fourth, if the owner had no money to buy back the land, it would still revert to him after the 7 Sabbath years, in the Jubilee. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 28. Fifth, God made it clear that the Israelites were strangers and sojourners in their own land. God being the owner, their status was similar to that of their stay in Egypt. They were there at the sufferance of the Lord and on his terms. Sixth, townhouses could be permanently alienated or sold once the purchase was completed. Being built by men, these properties could be freely transferred. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 29 to 34. Seventh, it was apparently possible to sell the land permanently if the sale were to a family member. If Jeremiah chapter 32 verses 7 and 8 is any indication. Ginsburg gives an important insight into the meaning of this law in his comment on Leviticus chapter 25, verse 23. God has not only helped the Israelites to conquer the land of Canaan, but has selected it as his own dwelling place and erected his sanctuary in the midst of it. Exodus chapter 15, verse 13, Numbers chapter 35, verse 34. He, therefore, is enthroned in it as Lord of the soil, and the Israelites are simply his tenants at will. Chapters 14, verse 34, 20, verse 24, 23, verse 10, Numbers chapter 13, verse 2, chapter 15, verse 2. And as such will have to quit if they disobey his commandments. Chapters 18, verse 28, chapter 20, verse 22, chapter 26, verse 33, Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 63. For this reason, they are accounted as strangers and sojourners, and hence have no rights absolutely to sell that which is not theirs. Because the tabernacle and then the temple had the Holy of Holies, God's throne, the seat of his visible government of Israel, the land of Israel had a particular fixity required by law. God, as its landlord, allotted to it the various tribes, and he required that a stable character be given to the land by an unchanging family ownership of rural land. This act alone gave to Israel a rural conservatism comparable to that of peasant Europe. The important question for us is the present status of this law. Does it still have the same binding force? If so, how shall it be applied? And if not, does any significance remain to the law? It would appear that the binding force of this law has reference to the rural lands of the original allotment to the 12 tribes. The tribe of Dan later acquired a northern territory by conquest, Judges chapter 18, and we are not given any indication that the same law of the land applied to the new territory, which began almost as a territory outside the law. There is no evidence later that the Jews in dispersion felt that this law was mandatory outside of Israel, although the same loyalty to the land remained. The inalienability of the land was thus a characteristic of the throne area. A comparable concept on a lesser scale is the modern Vatican State, owned by the Vatican entirely, and hence not on the market for sale. The Holy Land was God's throne area and hence not for sale. On the other hand, God's ownership of the whole earth is basic to biblical law, so that the throne rights extend very clearly to every part of the earth. The throne, however, is now in heaven, which has in full the unchanging status once required of Canaan. Obviously, therefore, land can now be sold. Just as obviously, God does intend that land laws give a stability to society. The absence of any land and property tax in biblical law very definitely protects enduring ownership, whereas modern tax laws destroy ownership. To cite an example in one city, a lovely area of very superior homes from 10 to 20 rooms, some of stone construction became, in about 25 years, so heavily taxed that the homes either had to be torn down to make way for apartments or sold for use as dormitories. The ownership of these homes was made prohibitive to impossible by means of taxes. In another area, taxes led to the deterioration of the area as people moved out and homes were made into multiple dwellings. Taxes then went down and others moved in, so that a 90% change in population occurred in less than 10 years. People who had built there, expecting to remain for life, lost heavily. Taxation of property is a means of destroying property and is a form of robbery. Taxation makes for the speculative use of land, and it destroys the stability of communities. There is a marked hostility today to the development and preservation of communities by religious and ethnic groups, and such hostility leads to the destruction of property. The destruction of the Boston West End Italian community by urban redevelopment and, quote, slum clearance, end quote, has been ably described by H.J. Gans. A family-centered society, extensively policing and disciplining itself, was broken up by a, quote, slum clearance, end quote, project because the area was coveted by planners. Both the taxing power and the eminent domain exercised are anti-biblical. Eminent domain is a divine right. It belongs to God alone. The quote-unquote right of the state to eminent domain has no place in biblical law. The state has a duty to protect man and his property, but not to tax or to confiscate it. To summarize the biblical tax laws in relationship to the ownership of land, the basic tax was the poll or head tax, Exodus chapter 30, verses 11 to 16, which had to be the same for all men. It was paid by men only, and all men of age 20 and over. This tax was collected by the civil authority for the maintenance of the civil order, to provide all men with a covering or atonement of civil justice. The tithe met the general religious and social needs of the community, education, welfare, and the like. There was thus no land tax or property tax. Since the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, Psalm 24 verse 1, Exodus chapter 9 verse 29, etc., a land tax usurps God's rights and is unlawful. The purpose of biblical law with reference to land is to ensure the security of man in his property. A property tax of any kind is a denial of this God-ordained security.